In 79 AD, beneath the roaring stone Colosseum of Rome, a 19-year-old woman from the Dacian highlands stood alone in a lightless cell. Her name was Sabina. Above her, 50,000 Romans celebrated the gladiator who had just killed her brothers in the sand. What happened to her over the next 3 hours was one of the most deliberately buried chapters in Roman history. A practice so disturbing that even Rome's own historians wrestled with whether to put it to paper at all. This is the story that Roman senators tried to erase, the reward system that gave a victor near absolute power behind closed doors. Before we get into what unfolded beneath that arena, welcome to Crimson Vault, where we pull back the curtain on the histories that powerful institutions spent centuries trying to quietly forget. What you are about to hear draws from the historical accounts of Cassius Dio, supported by Senate documents held in Vatican archives, and confirmed by excavation findings beneath the Colosseum in 2018. This is not folklore. These events were labeled sport by Rome itself. The Colosseum was not simply a building. It was Rome's most powerful statement of dominance, completed in 80 AD and large enough to swallow entire armies within its walls. The air inside always carried the smell of metal, sweat, and animal. The sand on the arena floor was not decorative. It was functional, spread thick to absorb whatever poured from dying men and wild beasts. Beneath that sand was an elaborate underground network of tunnels and cages housing Rome's most carefully managed assets: the condemned, the captured, and the conquered. Gladiator games served purposes far beyond entertainment. They were political messaging, religious theater, and social intimidation compressed into a single afternoon. When General Marcus Antonius crushed the Dacian uprising in 78 AD, he returned to Rome with not only treasure, but 847 captives. Among them were 120 well-noble women, not ordinary villagers but chieftains, priestesses, warriors, and daughters of leaders. Rome understood that military victory alone was insufficient. To prevent future rebellion, it needed to break the spirit of conquered people so thoroughly that resistance would feel unthinkable for generations. The treatment of these women was not incidental to that plan, it was central to it. Into this world stepped Gaius Valerius Maximus, 32 years old, nearly 6 feet tall, and built like a man who had survived 14 years of continuous violence. His body carried the record of 89 kills in official combat, each scar a chapter in a brutal biography. He had been born into slavery after his father died in debtor's prison, and he had spent every year since fighting simply to remain alive. His ambition was modest by any civilian standard: earn the rudies, the wooden sword of freedom awarded to gladiators who had proven themselves beyond question. His greatest fear was the anonymous ending that claimed most men in his profession dragged from the sand on iron hooks without a name called after them. On an August afternoon in 79 AD, he defeated the Dacian champion in front of Emperor Titus himself. His reward followed standard protocol: 500 denarii, a laurel wreath, and first selection among the female captives held in the arena's lower chambers. Sabina stood among 17 other women in the holding area. Before Rome arrived at her village, she had been engaged to a warrior named Decebalus, killed by Roman troops 3 months earlier. She waited in silence, having already lost everything that defined her world. What she feared most was becoming a performance for the same crowd that had cheered her people's destruction. That morning, a guard had told her she had been selected for the afternoon's proceedings. She did not yet understand what that meant. She was about to discover that Rome's version of mercy could be more terrifying than its cruelty. What Rome practiced here was not random violence. It was a deliberate system of psychological warfare. Physical conquest, Rome understood, was never truly complete on its own. True domination required breaking a people's symbols, undermining their traditions, and demonstrating that even the most protected members of their society now existed under Rome's authority. This was targeted humiliation deployed as imperial policy, a message sent across every conquered territory: resistance is futile and defeat is total. At 3 in the afternoon, a shadow stretched across the bloodied arena floor. The master of games descended into the Hypogeum, the underground complex beneath the Colosseum. He approached Gaius Valerius Maximus holding a bronze tablet listing the available rewards: gold, wine, comfortable lodging, or what Rome officially recorded as Victoria Carnales, the carnal privilege extended to victors under imperial tradition. For a man who legally owned nothing and could be executed at any moment, this represented one of the only instances in his life when he held genuine authority over anything at all. Roman society did not merely permit this arrangement, it celebrated it. The conquered existed to satisfy the conqueror. That was the empire's logic, refined over centuries into something that felt almost procedural. In the women's holding area, preparation had already begun. Guards entered carrying buckets of water. The women were washed, their hair was combed out, and their torn garments were replaced with plain tunics. Attendants moved between them, making notes on wax tablets. An older woman among the captives, a priestess named Zamoxis, who had once served at a Dacian sun temple, whispered what everyone already suspected. They are getting us ready either for the show or for what comes after. Above them, 50,000 spectators filled their seats for the afternoon's secondary program. Between the major gladiator bouts, arena officials staged what they called interludes, mock hunts, scripted battles, and theatrical pieces that Roman writers described as mythological reenactments. These often required condemned prisoners to act out legends that concluded in real deaths. That afternoon's showcase had been designed with a particular purpose in mind, a theatrical display celebrating Rome's triumph over Dacian resistance. 20 Dacian women were raised to the arena floor through the underground elevator system, an engineering achievement designed to send animals, fighters, and props erupting through trapdoors. Sabina stepped into blinding sunlight and a wall of noise. The crowd's roar felt physical. She could smell roasting food from vendors, perfume drifting down from the upper seats, and underneath it all, the iron scent of dried blood baking into the sand. What had been framed as a straightforward display was designed for something deeper. The women were lined up as a herald announced their supposed offenses: rebellion, aiding enemies of Rome, refusing Roman gods. Then came the structure of the showcase. They would be made to fight each other in pairs, armed with wooden swords and dressed in torn garments designed to mock their origins. The winners would be claimed by Rome's champions. The losers would not survive the afternoon. Wooden swords were distributed. Sabina gripped hers, the rough grain pressing into her palm. Standing across from her was Camacicus, Decebalus' sister, the woman who had taught her to weave and sung at her engagement ceremony. Their eyes met. The crowd screamed for action. The master of games raised his hand and dropped it. Neither woman moved. The roar shifted from excitement to confusion and then to anger. Insults and thrown food rained down from the stands. Olive pits, scraps, whatever spectators had within reach. Still, the women stood without raising their swords. For 90 seconds, the greatest empire on earth was publicly defied by 2 unarmed women choosing stillness over performance. Then the guards rushed in. Camacicus was struck from behind with the flat of a blade and collapsed into the sand. Sabina screamed, dropped her sword, and ran toward her. Both were dragged from the arena floor. They were not taken to execution. They were taken below. The bureaucratic machinery of the Roman arena continued without interruption. A scribe entered a notation into the official record: 20 female captives, Dacian origin, processed for post-victory allocation. Below that, 2 resistant individuals transferred to private chambers for champion use. What followed was Rome's most practiced form of dehumanization, human beings reduced to line items in an administrative document. Sabina and Camacicus were separated and placed in different rooms. These were small stone chambers with benches, iron rings embedded in the walls, and doors that locked only from the outside. They were clean, organized, and deliberately designed. These rooms had not been improvised. They were part of the original architectural plan of the arena, built with the same intentionality as the lion cages and the gladiator lifts. At 4 in the afternoon, Gaius Valerius Maximus entered Sabina's chamber. He was still wearing his arena gear. Someone else's blood was dried across his chest plate. She pressed herself against the far wall, exhausted and unarmed, bracing for what Roman law had granted him the authority to do. He held complete legal power in that room. She held none. She had been classified as a spoil of conquest, a reward earned through combat. History does not record what passed through his mind in that moment. What we know comes from a clerk's routine report, not from either of them. He removed his helmet. He set his sword against the wall. He sat down on the bench with his head in his hands and said nothing for 5 minutes. Sabina remained still, waiting. Finally, in broken diction picked up from other captives over the years, he asked her a question. "What was his name?" he said. "The man they made you watch died today." "Desibalus," she replied quietly. He sighed. "I killed a man named Desibalus in the arena this afternoon. Could be family. Your people use that name often." What followed was not what Rome had engineered the moment to produce. It was a conversation between two people the empire had worked to strip of every human quality. He told her about his father, executed when he was 9 years old. She told him how her village had been burned. Guards checked twice during those 2 hours, heard voices through the door, assumed compliance, and moved on. At 6 in the evening, Gaius Valerius Maximus stood, walked to the chamber door, and called for the guard on duty. "This woman is ill," he said. "She shows signs of infection. I am declining the allocation. Send her to the physician's ward." It was the only legal loophole the arena system provided. If a captive was designated as diseased, a gladiator could formally decline her and return her to general prisoner status. The deception was transparent. The guard recognized it immediately, but Roman bureaucracy operated on rigid procedure. Challenging a gladiator's declared decision required paperwork, witnesses, and a formal inquiry. Accepting the rejection required a single notation. Sabina was removed from the chamber and transferred to the medical holding area. She died 3 days later from a routine infection, the most common cause of death in Roman captivity. The medical ward was overcrowded and poorly supplied. The act that spared her from one form of suffering delivered her into another. Gaius never saw her again. He fought 2 more bouts that month and won both. He declined the customary reward each time. The whispers in the gladiator barracks spread quickly. Some said he had grown weak. Others claimed he had joined one of the Eastern religious movements, spreading through the city, the ones that spoke about compassion for the suffering. Others said the Dacian women had put a curse on him. The truth was straightforward. He had remembered that he was a person, and so had she. On September 15th, 79 AD, Senator Quintus Aurelius Coronicus arrived before the Senate with a formal complaint. His young nephew, a junior gladiator, had been beaten by his trainer after refusing the customary post-victory reward. The nephew cited Maximus as the reason for his refusal. The trainer argued he was simply maintaining proper Roman standards. The case was minor and would ordinarily never have reached the Senate floor, except for one consequence. It forced Rome's most powerful men to publicly acknowledge a practice that everyone in the city was aware of, but that no senator had ever been required to discuss out loud. The surviving Senate records describe the debate in deliberately mild language, referring to questions about the appropriateness of certain customs regarding defeated female captives. That careful phrasing concealed a 4-hour political confrontation. The conservative faction invoked tradition and ancestral precedent. The reformist faction, influenced by Stoic philosophy, raised a practical concern. Rome was not intimidating its conquered peoples. It was radicalizing them. 3 provincial governors had recently reported surges in regional revolt, each citing Rome's treatment of captive women as a rallying point for resistance movements. The empire was generating its own enemies. On the 1st of October, 79 AD, the Senate passed a measure that historians later called the Lex Captivorum. Under its terms, female prisoners of war could no longer be distributed as public rewards in arena settings. The theatrical display of captured women in official spectacles was prohibited. Private exploitation continued, and enforcement of the new law was inconsistent at best, with many arena managers finding ways around it. But a public boundary had been formally acknowledged. Even Rome, at a particular moment of political pressure, had reached a limit it was willing to name. The law freed no one. It only removed the audience. 3 months later, Gaius Valerius Maximus was awarded the rudis. He had earned his freedom not through mercy, but through 5 additional consecutive victories in the arena. His last documented act as a free man was purchasing the freedom of a Dacian woman named Camacicus. The archive records only her name. Historians believe with considerable confidence that she was the same woman who had stood beside Sabina on the arena floor that August afternoon. Consider what that calculation yields. One act of defiance in a locked stone chamber saved one woman for approximately 3 days. It changed nothing for the thousands who had come before her, and nothing for the thousands who would come after. The system was too large, too profitable, and too deeply embedded in Roman culture to be moved by a single gladiator's conscience. His rebellion was, as one later historian described it, a raindrop falling into an ocean. Sabina died in a cramped medical ward beneath the most celebrated structure of her era, killed by an infection that could have been treated with basic care. Not one senator debated her death. Not one historian recorded her name. In Rome's accounting of what mattered, her suffering did not rise to the level of documentation. The deeper tragedy is not simply that Rome was capable of cruelty. Cruelty defined most ancient warfare. The deeper tragedy is that Rome industrialized it. The process was standardized with paperwork, supply lines, and purpose-built architecture. It was made into entertainment. Human beings moved through the system and disappeared without leaving a trace beyond a scratched notation on stone. In 2018, archaeologists from the University of Rome, led by Dr. Isabella Fortunato, excavated a previously unexplored section of the Eastern Hypogeum. What they uncovered has not appeared in tourist materials: a cluster of small chambers with iron restraints built directly into the walls, drainage channels cut into the stone floors, scratch marks left by hands pressing against the walls, pottery fragments, remnants of bedding compressed by years of weight. Carbon dating placed the construction of these rooms at 80 AD, meaning they were part of the original design, not later additions. 6 bronze tags were recovered, each stamped with the word captiva and dates ranging from 79 to 82 AD, the precise years of the Dacian suppression. These physical findings aligned with the written record. Cassius Dio described allocation chambers in his later accounts. Seneca made veiled references to the practice in his letters without ever stating it plainly. Tacitus, who documented Roman violence with unusual directness in most instances, was conspicuously silent on this particular subject, which historians read as meaningful rather than coincidental. Roman society held a complicated and revealing relationship with its gladiators. Elite women bribed arena guards for access to them. Their images appeared on lamps and painted walls. Their blood and sweat were sold commercially, sometimes marketed as health remedies. The same culture that elevated these men also fed them into a killing system and used them as instruments of a reward structure built on the bodies of the conquered. What the story of Sabina, Gaius, and the Lex Captivorum ultimately reveals is a pattern that did not begin and did not end with Rome. A civilization can build aqueducts that last 2,000 years and simultaneously construct chambers beneath its stadiums for purposes it will later work to hide from its own historians. Brilliance and moral failure do not cancel each other out. They coexist, and they always have. Gaius himself is an illustration of how power distorts everyone it touches. He was enslaved, controlled, forced to kill for survival, and then handed authority over someone even more helpless than himself. The system converted ordinary people into instruments of cruelty, and it worked precisely because it wrapped that cruelty in the language of tradition, law, and celebration. The warning embedded in Rome's story is one about what happens when habit replaces moral reasoning. When a society stops asking whether something is right and begins treating the fact that it has always been done as sufficient justification, atrocity becomes routine without anyone making a single dramatic decision to allow it. It simply continues, and it leaves behind questions we have not finished answering. What else lies beneath the monuments we visit and admire? How many celebrated historical sites sit above layers of suffering that never made it into the official record? When does examining the past become essential, and when does the way we examine it risk becoming its own form of spectacle? Sabina died wondering, perhaps, whether anyone would ever speak her name again. 2,000 years later, archaeologists found her tag pressed into the earth beneath the Colosseum floor, and someone did. History's most difficult stories carry the reminder that progress is never guaranteed, that civilizations can collapse morally long before they collapse structurally, and that every generation inherits the choice between empathy and efficiency. Rome chose spectacle. The cost was measured in lives the record chose not to keep. The lesson remains in the stone. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Crimson Vault, because the histories that were meant to disappear are often the ones that matter most. Leave a comment below telling us what disturbed you most, whether it was the calculated nature of the system, Rome's ability to make it feel routine, or the fact that one gladiator's small act of humanity changed almost nothing and still somehow mattered. The blood on the arena sand was not always the result of combat. Sometimes it came from the moments when power had no restraint and cruelty received applause.